Retired veteran mocked for inheriting broken gas station until a $200 million secret surfaced. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It begins with a man who had nothing left. Frank was a retired veteran, living a quiet life in a small town in the Midwest. He spent most of his days alone in a modest house, far removed from the busy life he had once known in the military. Frank had seen and done things in his service that left a mark on him. But after retiring, the hardest battle he faced was finding purpose. The days blurred together, the silence of his empty house filling every corner. Little did he know, his life was about to change in the most unexpected way. Frank had never been close to his extended family. He was a loner, a man who kept to himself, especially after the loss of his wife many years ago. But when his distant uncle, a man Frank had barely spoken to in years, passed away, Frank received an unexpected letter. The letter was short, formal, but the message was clear. Frank had inherited his uncle's estate. But what Frank didn't expect was that the estate wasn't much to speak of, just a rundown gas station on the outskirts of town. The letter explained that the gas station had been in the family for decades, but it was now in a state of disrepair, with no customers, no employees, and no hope of ever making a profit again. The roof was caving in, the pumps were rusted, and the building itself seemed to be falling apart. Frank didn't know why his uncle left him this, or why he would inherit something so worthless. The townspeople laughed when they heard the news. What's he going to do with that old gas station? They said, might as well tear it down and sell the land. It's a lost cause. Frank wasn't sure what to do either. He had no use for the gas station, but something in him told him to give it a try. Maybe it was the memories of his uncle, maybe it was the sense of duty from his military days, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this place than met the eye. With a sigh, Frank drove out to the station the next morning, determined to at least clean it up. The wind was cold, and the gas station was as bleak as he remembered from his childhood visits. As he stepped out of his truck, the sight of the crumbling building hit him hard. He could hear the faint hum of the wind through the broken windows, and the old sign creaked eerily in the breeze. But Frank wasn't one to back down from a challenge, no matter how grim it seemed. He grabbed a broom, rolled up his sleeves, and started clearing out the old, dusty interior. Little did he know, beneath the dust and rust, there was something hidden, a secret that would change his life forever. It's been a few days since Frank had stepped into the dilapidated gas station, and while the town's mockery still echoed in his mind, Frank was determined to make something of the property. He wasn't sure why he felt this pull, this deep sense of duty to honor his uncle's legacy, but he couldn't let the place fall apart. It was like the gas station was a piece of him, broken, old, and forgotten. The town may have laughed, but Frank had a history of pushing through adversity. That was how he had survived in the military, after all. But this was different. This wasn't a battle he could win with just grit and perseverance. This was going to require something more. It had been a week since he'd started clearing the place out. Frank had already spent countless hours sweeping up the dust, scrubbing the floors, and trying to restore the old pumps, though it seemed hopeless. Each time he managed to fix one thing, another part of the station would fall apart. But Frank wasn't a man to give up easily. The more time he spent here, the more he felt a strange connection to the place, as though it was trying to tell him something. That was when it happened. As Frank worked in the back storage area, shifting boxes of old supplies, he noticed something strange. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath him, a little louder than usual. At first, he thought it was just the house settling, but then he noticed something odd. There was a small crack in the floor where it didn't seem to belong. Frank knelt down, carefully lifting the boards with his hands, and there, hidden beneath, was something he didn't expect. A large metal hatch. It was rusty and worn, almost blending in with the old wooden floor. Frank's heart raced with excitement and curiosity. He had spent so much time in this place, but he had never noticed this hatch before. He ran his fingers over the edges, feeling the cold metal beneath the dust. There was a small handle, but it was stuck. He tugged at it, gritting his teeth as the metal groaned under the pressure. Finally, With a loud creak, the hatch lifted. A cloud of dust rushed up, and Frank coughed, wiping his hand over his face. He grabbed a flashlight from his pocket, shining it into the dark space below. The beam illuminated the narrow staircase that led downward into darkness. Frank's mind raced. What could be down there? Why had no one ever mentioned this? With a deep breath, he grabbed the flashlight and descended into the dark. The air was cold, musty, and thick with the scent of age. The steps creaked under his weight as he slowly made his way down. The stairwell seemed to go on forever, but after what felt like an eternity, Frank's feet finally touched solid ground. He looked around, his heart pounding. The room he had entered was eerily quiet, with only the sound of his breathing filling the space. It was a small, cramped room with stone walls. Frank's flashlight flickered as he moved, scanning the area. At first, it seemed like an old storage room, with dusty shelves lined with cans and jars. But then he noticed something even more curious. A large metal chest in the corner of the room. Frank's pulse quickened. What was this? Had his uncle known about this hidden room? Or was this something far older, perhaps dating back to when the gas station had first been built? His hands trembled as he walked toward the chest, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The chest was locked, but it had a strange emblem engraved on its surface. Frank ran his fingers over the intricate design, recognizing it as something he had seen before, back in his military days. It was a symbol used during World War II, one associated with secret government operations. Frank's mind raced. What had his uncle gotten himself involved in? Why was this chest hidden away in the gas station? As he examined the chest more closely, Frank's mind was flooded with questions. The mystery deepened with every passing moment. He knew he had to open it. He just had to know what was inside. Without hesitation, he found an old crowbar in the corner of the room and began prying open the chest. The metal screeched as it gave way, and finally, the chest was open. Inside, Frank found stacks of old papers, faded maps, and a small leather pouch. His fingers shook as he opened the pouch, revealing something that made his heart stop. It was a small gold bar. Frank stared at it for a moment, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Could this be real? And if so, what was this treasure doing in his uncle's gas station? But as he dug deeper into the chest, he discovered more. Gold coins, rare artifacts, and other treasures that were worth more than he could have ever imagined. Frank's head spun. This was no ordinary inheritance. It was a $200 million fortune, hidden away for decades, just waiting for him to find it. The weight of the discovery sank in. This gas station, once seen as a worthless piece of property, was now the key to a fortune beyond anything Frank had ever dreamed of. But there was one problem. He wasn't the only one who knew about the treasure, and Frank was about to find out just how far people would go to claim what was rightfully his. I have to say, Frank had not been prepared for what came next. As he stood there, stunned by the treasure he had uncovered, the weight of it all started to sink in. His mind raced. This was more than he could ever have imagined. 100,000 questions flooded his thoughts. Why was this hidden here? What had his uncle been involved in? And most importantly, who else knew about it? Frank couldn't help but feel like he had just stumbled upon something far bigger than he had ever intended. As he stood there, staring at the pile of gold bars and rare artifacts, he realized that the quiet life he had planned on living in his retirement was never going to happen. The storm was just beginning. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and tension. Frank had contacted an old friend, Mark, a former military intelligence officer who had connections to people in high places. Mark was the only person Frank trusted with this discovery. He arrived at the gas station the following afternoon, his sharp eyes scanning the place with suspicion. "You're sure this is the real deal?" Mark asked, looking over the gold bars and stacks of old documents that littered the floor of the hidden room. Frank nodded, still trying to come to terms with the fact that he was now the owner of what could be considered one of the most valuable treasure troves in the country. "I don't know how it got here," Frank said, his voice a little shaky. "But it's real." Mark nodded and then carefully examined the papers. "These are military contracts," he said, flipping through them. "Top secret stuff. And these maps, they lead to something even bigger. This wasn't just your uncle's treasure. This was planned out. Someone went to a lot of trouble to keep it hidden." Frank was starting to understand that this treasure was more than just a windfall. It was the key to something much more significant. But what was it? And who had put it all together? That night, as Frank lay in bed, he heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up outside. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't have any visitors, not this late at night. He quickly got out of bed, grabbed his flashlight, and crept to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. A black SUV was parked in front of the gas station, its windows darkened. Frank's instincts kicked in, and he knew he wasn't alone in this discovery anymore. Someone else had found out. Frank felt a chill run down his spine as he watched two figures emerge from the vehicle. They moved with a certain purpose, and Frank could tell they weren't here for anything good. The figures moved quickly toward the back of the building, where Frank had hidden the hatch to the underground room. Frank's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't have much time. He grabbed his phone and dialed Mark's number, hoping he could reach him before it was too late. The phone rang once, twice, then picked up. "Mark, they're here. We've got company." Mark's voice was calm, but Frank could hear the urgency in it. "Stay inside. Don't let them see you. I'm on my way." Frank hung up the phone and moved quietly back to the back door, taking a deep breath as he watched the men approach. They were close now. Frank knew they weren't here to admire the old gas station. They were after something, and Frank wasn't about to let them take it. He grabbed the crowbar again, ready to defend the treasure that had already changed his life. But as the men got closer, Frank could hear one of them say something that made his blood run cold. "The veteran's here. He found it. Time to take care of him." The words hit Frank like a punch to the gut. Whoever these men were, they knew exactly what he had found, and they weren't about to let him keep it. Frank's mind raced. This was no longer just about protecting a gas station or an inheritance. It was about his life. He needed to act fast. The men were getting closer to the hatch. He had no choice but to make a decision. As the figures reached for the back door, Frank slammed it open with all his strength. The men froze, caught off guard. Frank didn't hesitate. He lunged at them with the crowbar raised, swinging it with everything he had. The men scrambled backward, clearly surprised by the sudden attack. "Stay away from my property," Frank shouted, his voice shaking with anger and fear. The men exchanged a glance, clearly weighing their options. They weren't expecting a fight, but they quickly pulled out weapons of their own. Frank's heart raced as he faced them down. He knew he couldn't fight them off forever, but he also knew he had to try. His life, and the treasure, depended on it. And so, the battle began. I can hear my heart pounding in my chest, each beat a drum of urgency. Frank stood face to face with the two men in front of him, both with cold, calculating eyes. They were more prepared for this confrontation than he ever anticipated. The crowbar was still clutched in his hands, but he knew deep down he wasn't going to be able to hold them off forever. They were bigger, faster, and likely had more resources at their disposal. The men didn't hesitate. One of them pulled a gun, pointing it directly at Frank. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet stayed rooted in place. The other man circled around, trying to flank Frank and reach the hatch. Frank's mind raced as he tried to figure out his next move. He had no idea who these people were, but one thing was clear: they weren't just after the gold. They were after something far more dangerous, something Frank had yet to fully understand. "You don't know what you've found, do you?" one of the men said, his voice cold and mocking. Frank narrowed his eyes, still gripping the crowbar. "I know enough," Frank shot back. "And I'm not letting you take it." The man with the gun smirked. "You don't have a choice, old man. This treasure is bigger than you. It's bigger than your little gas station. You think you're the only one who knows about it." Frank's stomach dropped. He wasn't just dealing with ordinary criminals. These men had to be involved in something much larger than himself. The idea that others had been after this treasure for years, possibly even decades, left him in a cold sweat. "Move aside," the other man growled, stepping closer to Frank, his hand reaching for the hatch. Frank's eyes darted between them. He had to do something, anything to stop them from getting their hands on whatever lay beneath the gas station. The man with the gun was too close now. Frank had no choice. With all his strength, he lunged forward, swinging the crowbar at the man's arm. The gun went flying out of his hand, skidding across the floor, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he shoved Frank back with brutal force, sending him stumbling to the ground. Frank's head hit the concrete with a sickening thud, his vision blurring for a moment. He shook it off quickly, scrambling to his feet. The second man was now at the hatch, prying it open with ease, as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. "This is the moment, Frank," the man said over his shoulder. "The moment when you realize just how much danger you're in. We've been waiting for this treasure for far too long." Frank's blood ran cold. He didn't have time to process the full weight of those words. The men were almost there. He couldn't let them get to the treasure. "Not today," Frank muttered through gritted teeth. He glanced around desperately. That's when his eyes locked onto the gun. It was close, too close to leave untouched. Frank made a split-second decision. He darted toward it, grabbing it with trembling hands, pointing it directly at the men. They froze. The tension in the room was suffocating. Frank's finger hovered over the trigger. "You really think you can stop us?" the first man sneered, stepping forward. Frank's heart raced as he leveled the gun. He wasn't sure what he was willing to do, but he knew he couldn't let these men walk away with the treasure. The situation had gone beyond what he could handle with his fists or a crowbar. He needed to protect what he had found, what had already changed his life. "Step back," Frank warned, his voice steady but strained. For a moment, there was silence. The man with the gun was watching him carefully, sizing him up. The other man, who had been so focused on the hatch, finally turned around, his eyes narrowing. "You have no idea who you're messing with, do you?" he said, his tone low and dangerous. Frank didn't flinch. "I'm messing with the wrong people, and I'm going to make sure you regret it." The man with the gun smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of someone who knew he had more tricks up his sleeve. "We're not going anywhere. And neither are you." Frank's grip on the gun tightened, his finger pressing down a little harder on the trigger. The moment hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. Just as Frank was about to make his move, a loud crash echoed from the back of the room. Frank turned, his heart racing again, expecting another attack. But it wasn't more men. It was Mark. Frank's old friend, the military intelligence officer, had arrived just in time. Mark was behind the men, his own weapon raised and aimed directly at them. "That's enough," Mark said, his voice cold and commanding. "Put the guns down." The two men slowly turned, their faces betraying their surprise. Mark was no stranger to dangerous situations, and he had a way of exuding authority. The men hesitated, clearly weighing their options. Mark took a step forward. "This is your last chance," he said, his tone unwavering. "You can leave now, and we'll forget this ever happened." The men exchanged a glance, then slowly backed away, their eyes never leaving Frank or Mark. They were defeated, but not without a glance of hatred. Mark kept his weapon trained on them as they retreated into the shadows of the night, disappearing without another word. Frank stood there, breathing heavily, still gripping the gun, his body trembling from the adrenaline. Mark lowered his weapon. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softening. Frank nodded slowly, still processing what had just happened. "I think we just made it out of this alive." Mark gave him a grim smile. "For now, anyway." Frank stared at the hatch, the treasure still waiting below. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. It had been days since the confrontation with the two men, and Frank still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The discovery of the treasure beneath the gas station had turned his life upside down, but it also attracted attention he hadn't expected. Mark had stayed with him for a few days, helping Frank secure the area and make sense of what they had uncovered. But deep down, Frank knew that the treasure wasn't just about gold and rare artifacts. It was about something far more dangerous, something that someone, or maybe many people, were willing to kill for. Frank spent the next few days trying to piece together the clues from the hidden documents he had found in the chest. Mark had carefully examined each one, revealing bits of information that painted a disturbing picture. The papers were filled with government contracts, covert operations, and strange maps that didn't seem to make sense. One map stood out in particular. It showed the gas station and the surrounding area, but there were markings all over it, pointing to locations Frank had never noticed before. "This is a government project," Mark said, running his finger over the map. "These documents, they're connected to something bigger. Your uncle wasn't just hiding treasure. He was part of something that went far deeper than we can understand." Frank wasn't sure what Mark meant, but he felt the weight of those words. The more he learned, the less he understood. His uncle had been involved in something that could change the course of history, but how? And why hide it all under a crumbling gas station in the middle of nowhere? Frank's mind raced, and the sense of danger grew stronger by the minute. He knew that if he didn't figure out what was going on soon, he and Mark would be in even more trouble than they already were. That's when the phone call came. It was late one night, and Frank had just finished going over the last of the documents when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something told him it was important. He picked up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Frank, it's time we talk." The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. Frank immediately recognized the voice. It was one of the men who had tried to steal the treasure. "You should have stayed out of this, Frank," the man continued, his voice laced with a thinly veiled threat. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into." Frank's grip tightened around the phone. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to steady his breathing. "We want the treasure, and we'll do whatever it takes to get it." The line went dead. Frank stared at the phone in disbelief. The warning was clear. There was no backing out now. Frank knew the men wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. He had to act fast. Without wasting another second, Frank grabbed his keys and told Mark they had to leave. The gas station wasn't safe anymore. They needed to figure out what was really going on before it was too late. Mark grabbed his bag and followed Frank to the truck, his face a mask of concern. "Where are we going?" Mark asked as Frank started the engine. Frank glanced at him, the weight of everything pressing on him. "I don't know yet, but we need to find out who's behind this. I need to know why this treasure is so important." They drove for hours, leaving the gas station and the town behind, heading into the unknown. Frank's mind was racing. Who were these men? And why had his uncle kept such dangerous secrets? It felt like the more he uncovered, the less he understood. After several hours on the road, Frank pulled over at a small diner in the middle of nowhere. The neon sign flickered in the dark, casting an eerie glow over the quiet street. Frank needed to think, and he knew the best way to clear his head was to speak with someone who might know more. The diner was nearly empty when they walked in. The waitress, an older woman with a stern expression, gave them a once-over before greeting them with a slight nod. "What can I get you?" she asked. Frank hesitated before speaking. "We're looking for information. About an old gas station. A place called the Birchwood Station." The woman paused, her face hardening slightly. "What's your interest in that place?" she asked, her tone more guarded now. Frank looked at Mark, unsure of how much to say. "We just need to know what happened there. Something's not right." The waitress studied them for a moment, then sighed, pulling up a chair to join them. "You're not the first to ask about that place," she said in a low voice. "I've lived here all my life, and there's always been rumors about the Birchwood Station. No one really knows the full story, but it's tied to something bigger than anyone can imagine. It's always been a bit off." "Off how?" Mark asked, leaning in. The waitress looked around nervously before continuing. "People say it was part of an old government operation. Something secret. There were strange things going on there back in the day. A lot of people came and went, but no one ever stayed long. They just vanished." Frank felt a chill run down his spine. This was the first solid lead they had gotten. "Who were these people?" he asked urgently. "No one knows for sure, but there were rumors. Some said they were military, others said they were government agents. Whatever it was kept under wraps." The woman paused, as if weighing whether she should continue. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. They were searching for something, and it wasn't just any treasure. It was something that could change everything. Frank and Mark exchanged a look. It was the confirmation they needed. Whatever this treasure was, it was more than just gold. It had the potential to alter the course of history. And now, they were in the middle of it all. It had been a few days since Frank and Mark had visited the diner, but the weight of the waitress's words kept running through Frank's mind. Something about the Birchwood Station, something hidden deep within the treasure, had the power to change everything. That small town, that forgotten gas station. What had his uncle been involved in? Why had he kept it a secret for so long? Frank couldn't let go of the feeling that there was more to this story. There had to be more. The treasure wasn't just a windfall. It was a key to something far bigger, and Frank was determined to find out what that was. After the visit to the diner, they spent hours researching. Mark's military connections proved useful, allowing them to access old government records and classified documents that had long been buried. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that the treasure was tied to a covert operation from decades ago. It seemed that the gas station had been a front for something far darker, a series of underground meetings and deals that no one outside the government ever knew about. But the more Frank and Mark delved into these records, the more questions arose. Who were these people involved? What were they really after? And most importantly, What had Frank's uncle known about all of this? Late one evening, while Frank was going over yet another stack of papers, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark. "I've got a lead. Meet me at the old library." Frank didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, slid the phone into his pocket, and headed out. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that made Frank feel uneasy. The old library Mark had mentioned was located on the outskirts of town, a crumbling building that looked abandoned to most. But Frank knew better. The library had been an important place in the past, a hub for information that had long since been forgotten. When Frank arrived, Mark was already there, standing near the entrance, looking around cautiously. "You sure this is safe?" Frank asked, eyeing the dark building. Mark gave him a look that said it all. "I hope so." Together, they entered, the door creaking behind them as they stepped into the dust-covered interior. The library had been silent for years, the shelves stacked high with books that had once been the town's knowledge, now forgotten. Mark led Frank to the back of the library, where a small door, barely noticeable, stood half-hidden beneath a pile of old books. It was locked, but Mark had a key. As the door creaked open, they descended into the basement, the air cold and stale. The basement was filled with boxes, old files, and forgotten relics of a past that had been swept under the rug. But in the far corner, a small desk stood, cluttered with papers and maps. Mark reached for one of the maps, spreading it out on the desk. Frank's eyes widened. This wasn't just any map. This was a blueprint of the Birchwood station and its surrounding area, but with one major difference. There were new markings on it. "These weren't here before," Mark said, his finger tracing the new symbols. "These indicate something hidden, something we've missed." Frank leaned in closer. The markings seemed to lead to a part of the property Frank had never paid attention to before, a small, unmarked building behind the gas station. It hadn't been on any of the maps Frank had seen. This was new. Frank's heart began to race. "What is this?" he muttered under his breath. Mark's eyes were wide with realization. "We need to check it out. Now." The two of them left the library quickly, heading straight for the gas station. The drive felt longer than usual, the weight of the discovery hanging heavily between them. Frank's mind was spinning. What had they just found? What was hidden behind that small building? And why had no one ever mentioned it before? When they arrived, the gas station was eerily quiet, the pumps rusted and forgotten. Frank's flashlight swept across the grounds as they made their way behind the building. The unmarked structure was just as it appeared on the map, small, decaying, and completely out of place. Mark approached the door cautiously, but Frank was already ahead of him. He tried the door handle, but it was locked. Frank reached into his bag and pulled out a set of old tools he had found in the station's storage room. The lock was rusted, but with a few twists, it finally gave way. As Frank opened the door, a wave of stale air hit them both. Inside, it was dark, darker than the rest of the station. But Frank's flashlight illuminated what lay inside. The room was filled with old filing cabinets, some stacked on top of one another, others leaning against the walls. The strange thing was, there was a massive metal safe in the corner of the room, its surface covered in dust. Frank's breath caught in his throat. "This is it," he whispered. Mark nodded slowly. "This is where it all comes together." They approached the safe, but it was clear it wasn't going to be easy to open. The safe was heavy, its metal walls reinforced with steel. There was no combination lock, no simple way to break into it. "We need to find the key," Frank said. "It's got to be somewhere here." They searched the room, moving through piles of old papers and dusty boxes. And then Frank's eyes fell on something, an old metal box, buried beneath a stack of papers. He opened it cautiously. Inside, there was a set of keys. One of them had a tag that read safe. Frank held his breath. "This is it." He rushed to the safe, inserted the key, and turned it. The lock clicked. Frank swung the door open, his heart racing. Inside the safe were more documents, important ones. And as he flipped through them, he realized just how big this secret really was. This wasn't just about a treasure. This was about a conspiracy that had been hidden for decades, and Frank's uncle had been right in the middle of it. It had taken Frank and Mark hours to go through the files inside the safe, and yet, they still couldn't make sense of it all. There were contracts, old military documents, and references to operations that were so secret, they couldn't even begin to understand their full meaning. Frank was holding a stack of papers when one particular document caught his attention. It was a map of the gas station area, but it was marked with different coordinates, some pointing to spots deep in the surrounding forest. There was also a letter attached to it, written in his uncle's handwriting. Frank's heart raced as he read the letter aloud. If you are reading this, then you have found the treasure. But know this, there is more at stake than you realize. What's hidden here is not just gold. It's a key to a larger operation that has been kept secret for years. This treasure is not just mine. It belongs to something bigger, something dangerous. Frank paused, trying to catch his breath. The letter didn't explain much more, but it hinted at something far more sinister. Whatever this treasure was, it wasn't just for the taking. Someone had been protecting it for a reason. Mark, who had been scanning the documents nearby, turned to Frank. This is bigger than just some old treasure hunt, isn't it? He asked quietly. This has all the markings of a covert operation, something far beyond your uncle's involvement. Frank nodded, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him. But what are they trying to protect? He muttered. Why all the secrecy? They spent the next few hours analyzing the documents, trying to piece together the truth. Every new clue led to more questions, but none of them made the situation any clearer. Frank knew they had to go to the forest to investigate those coordinates. There was no turning back now. They couldn't keep running from the mystery. Mark agreed without hesitation, and together, they prepared for what might be the most dangerous part of their journey. The next morning, they packed their gear and drove toward the marked location on the map. The forest was dense and silent, the trees towering high above them as they made their way deeper into the wilderness. Frank couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as they ventured further. This wasn't just an ordinary forest. It felt as though the land itself was hiding something, guarding it fiercely. When they finally reached the coordinates on the map, Frank stopped the truck. They had arrived at a clearing, but there was nothing immediately visible. No abandoned buildings, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. Just trees, rocks, and the quiet hum of the forest. Mark was the first to get out of the truck. I don't like this, he muttered, scanning the area. It feels off. Frank agreed. There was something unnerving about the place. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Let's check the area, Frank said, trying to push through his unease. They spent the next hour searching the clearing. They moved through the underbrush, checking every inch of the ground for signs of a hidden entrance or anything unusual. Finally, as they moved toward the far edge of the clearing, Frank spotted something in the ground, an old metal hatch, almost completely covered in dirt and moss. Frank's heart raced. He had found it. This was the hidden entrance they were looking for. Mark immediately moved to help him clear the debris. Together, they pried the hatch open, revealing a steep metal staircase leading down into the darkness. Frank's hand shook as he held the flashlight, shining it down the stairs. It was like something straight out of a spy movie, the kind of place you'd expect to find secrets and hidden operations. Are you ready for this? Mark asked, his voice tense. Frank hesitated for a moment, then nodded. We don't have a choice. They descended into the underground passage, the smell of damp earth filling the air as they moved deeper. The flashlight beam flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The staircase seemed to go on forever, but eventually, they reached the bottom. The tunnel stretched out in front of them, dark and silent. Frank's instincts told him to be cautious. They weren't just dealing with treasure anymore. They were dealing with something much more dangerous. As they walked down the tunnel, they came to a heavy metal door. It looked ancient, the paint chipped and faded. The lock on the door was large and reinforced with thick metal. Frank knew that whatever lay behind this door was the key to understanding everything. Without hesitation, he reached for the door handle and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a vast underground chamber. Frank's breath caught in his throat as he stepped inside. The room was filled with old equipment, strange machines, and more files, some stacked neatly, some scattered across the floor as though left in a hurry. At the far end of the room, Frank could see a large control panel, its lights flickering weakly. It looked like a command center. Mark stepped forward, scanning the room. This is it, isn't it? He said, his voice filled with awe. This is the heart of whatever operation your uncle was involved in. Frank nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and excitement. They had just uncovered the center of a long-forgotten secret. But as Frank approached the control panel, his heart began to race again. This was only the beginning. There were still so many questions, and now, with everything laid out in front of him, he had to make a choice. What was he going to do with this knowledge? Who else knew about this place? And more importantly, who would stop at nothing to keep the secrets buried? It didn't take long for Frank to realize that he and Mark had just uncovered a monumental secret, far more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. The underground chamber, filled with outdated equipment, files, and what appeared to be a control center, wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a living testament to a covert operation that had been kept hidden for decades. Frank's fingers hovered over the buttons on the control panel, but the gravity of the situation made him hesitate. He glanced over at Mark, who was scanning the room, his expression grim. "What do you think?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do we open this? Is it worth the risk?" Frank didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing with questions. They had stumbled upon something that no one was meant to know about. This wasn't just some treasure trove. It was a key to a much larger operation, one that could change everything. His uncle's involvement, the government's secrets, the treasure, it all felt like a tangled web with no clear way out. "We have to know what we're dealing with," Frank finally said, his voice steady. "We can't just walk away now. There's too much at stake." Mark nodded, though his hesitation was evident. "All right," he said, "but we need to be careful. We don't know who else might be looking for this, or how far they'll go to stop us from exposing it." Frank agreed. His gut told him that the deeper they went, the more dangerous it would become. But he also knew there was no turning back. With a deep breath, he pressed a button on the control panel. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden hum, the room came to life. Screens flickered on, revealing maps, diagrams, and encrypted files that Frank couldn't begin to understand. One screen displayed a list of names, military codes, and dates, while another showed a map of the entire country, with pins marking various locations, some of which were connected to the Birchwood station. Frank's pulse quickened as he studied the screen. This wasn't just about the treasure. This was part of a larger network, a shadow operation that spanned the nation. The dots on the map indicated key sites that had been involved in something far more significant than a simple military project. This is bigger than we thought," Frank murmured, his eyes scanning the data. Mark stepped closer, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is all this?" Frank didn't know how to explain it. The names on the list were familiar. Many of them were military officers, politicians, and high-ranking officials. But the documents didn't tell the full story. It was clear that something was being hidden, something that these people had worked to conceal for years. As Frank clicked through the files, one document in particular caught his eye. It was titled Project Phoenix, and it contained details of a series of covert operations that had been carried out during the Cold War. The project, according to the file, had been designed to locate and secure rare resources, including gold, artifacts, and other materials that could be used for military purposes. But there was something even more shocking, a reference to a final phase of the project, one that was meant to be activated decades later. Frank's heart raced. This was no ordinary treasure hunt. It was part of a larger scheme, one that involved not only national security, but possibly even global power. And his uncle had been a key player in it all. Mark noticed Frank's reaction and stepped closer. "What is it?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Frank turned to him, his face pale. "I think we've just uncovered something that's been hidden for far too long. Project Phoenix, it's bigger than just the treasure. It's a legacy of control, manipulation, and power. And it's not over." Mark's eyes widened. "You're saying this is still active?" Frank didn't respond immediately. His mind was spinning, but he knew what he had to do. "We need to take this information to the right people," Frank said, his voice firm. "We need to expose this before anyone else can use it against us." But as Frank turned to gather the files, a sudden noise made both men freeze. It was faint at first, but growing louder. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Frank and Mark exchanged a look of alarm. They weren't alone. They had to move fast. Without a word, they grabbed what they could from the control panel and slipped out of the chamber. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing through the tunnel behind them. Frank's pulse quickened. They had to get out of there before whoever was on their tail reached them. They raced through the dark tunnel, the dim light from their flashlights barely cutting through the shadows. As they reached the bottom of the staircase, Frank heard the distinct sound of a door opening behind them. He didn't need to look to know that they were being followed. He could feel the heat of the pursuit. "We have to hurry," Mark urged, already ahead of Frank. Frank pushed himself harder, the weight of the files in his arms slowing him down. But he couldn't leave them behind. They were too important. The hatch was just ahead, and as they reached it, Frank pushed it open with all his strength. The cold night air rushed in as they climbed out of the underground chamber, panting and exhausted. But as they looked back, the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. They had made it out. For now. But Frank knew that the fight was far from over. Whoever had been watching them knew they were close, and they wouldn't stop until they had what Frank and Mark had found. With the information they had uncovered, there was no telling what kind of danger lay ahead. Frank didn't know who was out there or who he could trust, but one thing was certain. They couldn't keep running. It was time to make their next move, and time was running out. The night air was sharp as Frank and Mark made their way through the dense woods surrounding the gas station. The adrenaline from their narrow escape still coursed through Frank's veins, but the uncertainty of what was to come gnawed at him. They had barely made it out, but they knew that whoever had been watching them wouldn't let it end there. Frank glanced over at Mark, his face etched with the same concern. "We can't keep running," Frank said, his voice low but firm. "We need to figure out our next move. We need to expose this before it's too late." Mark nodded, but his eyes betrayed the weight of their situation. "It's not just about exposing it anymore," he said. "We're in too deep. Whoever is behind this knows we've got the files. They'll come for us." Frank's stomach twisted at the thought. He knew Mark was right. The operation they had uncovered wasn't just some conspiracy. It was a network of power and influence that stretched far beyond what they could handle alone. They needed help. But who could they trust? They couldn't go to the authorities. Too much of this was classified. Too dangerous. Frank needed to think fast. The next day, Frank and Mark met at an old safe house, a place Mark had used for situations like this. It was secluded, far from the eyes of anyone who might be tracking them. Inside, the two men pored over the documents once again, trying to make sense of everything. The more they studied the files, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about treasure, or even about what had happened in the past. This was about something far more insidious, something that had been set in motion decades ago. Frank stared at a document detailing Project Phoenix, the code name for the operation that had started during the Cold War. It was bigger than they had thought. The treasure was only part of it. The real objective was control. The treasure was a means to fund and sustain an underground network of political and military influence, a network that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Frank's heart raced as he read the final lines of the document. The final phase of the project is imminent. All assets must be secured. That phrase stuck with him. The final phase. What did that mean? What was the endgame? Frank slammed the file shut, frustration mounting. "This isn't just about money or gold," he said, his voice strained. "This is about power, and we're in the middle of it." Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We need to know what the final phase is. But how? We can't just keep digging without knowing what we're up against." Frank didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing. They couldn't go back to the gas station. The risk was too high. They needed to get out of town, lay low, and figure out a plan. But as Frank stood up to gather his things, he heard the faint sound of a car engine in the distance. His stomach dropped. They weren't alone. "We've been found," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank's mind raced. He grabbed the files and stuffed them into his bag, his heart hammering in his chest. "We need to move, now." They slipped out the back door of the safe house and into the woods, moving quickly and quietly. Frank's breath came in short bursts as they ran, the sound of footsteps behind them growing louder. Whoever was after them was closing in. They had to find a way to shake them off. Mark glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkened woods. "I've got an idea," he said. "Follow me." They cut through the forest, weaving between trees, trying to lose their pursuers in the darkness. Frank's mind was spinning, but he trusted Mark. Mark had been in situations like this before. They ran for what felt like miles, until the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, Frank's legs were sore, and his lungs burned. He looked around. They had made it to a remote part of the woods, a place neither of them had been before. "We should be safe here for now," Mark said, his voice steady. Frank nodded, but the feeling of being hunted still weighed heavily on him. They had no time to rest. As the sun began to rise, they made their way to an old abandoned cabin deep in the woods. Mark had a contact who could help them, someone who had the resources to get them out of town and help them expose what they had uncovered. But as they approached the cabin, Frank felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure why, but something felt off. They stepped inside, and Mark called out to his contact, but there was no answer. The cabin was eerily quiet. Then Frank noticed it. A faint smell of smoke, the kind that lingered after a fire had been put out. He motioned to Mark to stay quiet, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. As they moved further into the cabin, they saw it. The walls were lined with photographs, documents, and maps, all detailing the same operation they had uncovered. Frank's heart sank. They weren't alone here. Someone else had been tracking the same project. Someone else had been using this cabin as a base of operations. And now, Frank and Mark were right in the middle of it. Frank's grip tightened around the bag of files. He had no idea who they were dealing with now, but he knew one thing for certain. This fight was far from over. As Frank stepped further into the cabin, the weight of the discovery pressed heavily on his chest. The photographs and documents pinned to the walls were eerily familiar, each one detailing the same covert operation that had led them here. But something about the place felt different, as if the walls themselves were alive with secrets. The air was thick with tension, and Frank could feel every muscle in his body tightening. His instincts screamed that they weren't alone, and he was right. Mark, who had been carefully studying a set of maps pinned on the wall, turned to Frank. "This isn't just some hideout," he said quietly, his voice tinged with concern. "Whoever was here is still involved. This place is still being used." Frank's heart skipped a beat. They had just walked into a den of vipers. "We need to move," Frank whispered. "Who knows how many people are out there, watching us?" Mark nodded, but before they could make a move, they heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. Frank's body went rigid. They had been found. "Stay quiet," Frank hissed, motioning for Mark to crouch down behind the table. They crouched low, trying to stay out of sight, as the sound of footsteps grew louder. The door opened fully, revealing a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that looked out of place in the abandoned cabin. His cold, calculating gaze swept the room, but he didn't immediately spot Frank and Mark. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Frank's breath hitched as the man began to walk toward the desk, where the documents were spread out. Frank could hear his heart pounding in his ears. This was it. If the man found the files, everything they had worked for would be for nothing. The man reached for one of the documents and started flipping through it, his eyes scanning the text with precision. Frank motioned to Mark, signaling that they needed to act fast. They couldn't stay hidden forever. But before they could make a move, the man spoke. "I know you're here," he said, his voice low and calm. "There's no point in hiding." Frank and Mark froze. How could he have known? They hadn't made a sound. The man turned around slowly, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "You've been following me for days. I was wondering when you'd show up." Frank's heart raced. This man had been watching them. And now, it seemed like the tables had turned. "Who are you?" Frank demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "You don't need to know my name. But you do need to understand that you've just uncovered something far bigger than you realize. And now, you're involved." Frank felt a chill run down his spine. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just a random player in this game. He was someone who knew exactly what was at stake, and he wasn't going to let Frank and Mark get in the way. The man stepped closer to them, his eyes never leaving Frank's. "You think you can stop this? You think you can expose what's been hidden for decades?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just pawns in a much larger game. You always were." Frank swallowed hard, but he wasn't going to back down. "We're not backing down," he said, his voice sharp. "You can't keep this secret forever." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. "You don't understand. The operation is already in motion. It's too late for you to turn back. But I can promise you this. If you don't step aside, there will be consequences." Frank's fists clenched, but he kept his composure. He couldn't let fear control him now. Mark, who had been silently observing the situation, suddenly spoke up. "You think we're just going to walk away and let you get away with this?" he said, his voice steady. The man's gaze flicked to Mark, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device. Frank recognized it immediately. It was a small, portable electronic jammer, capable of disabling communications and tracking devices. "You're not going to get away with this," Frank repeated, his voice unwavering. The man chuckled darkly. I'm afraid you're already too late. He pressed a button on the device, and Frank's phone buzzed violently, signaling that it had been disabled. Mark's phone did the same. Now, you're completely cut off, the man said, his voice cold and final. No one will know where you are, and no one will come for you. Frank felt his heart race as the reality of their situation hit him. They were on their own now. But he wasn't going to let this man win. He had come too far. We'll find a way out, Frank said, his voice firm. You can't stop us. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, but before he left, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. This isn't over, he said. You've made a dangerous enemy. And with that, he left, the door clicking shut behind him. Frank and Mark exchanged a look, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. They had just barely escaped the clutches of whoever was pulling the strings, but they weren't out of danger yet. The final phase of Project Phoenix was still in motion, and Frank knew that if they didn't act quickly, they might never get another chance to stop it. They had to move fast, but they couldn't do it alone. It was time to find allies, real ones, and expose the truth before it was too late. Frank and Mark stood in silence, the reality of their situation sinking in. The man had left, but his words lingered in the air. They had made a dangerous enemy, and the stakes were higher than ever. Frank's heart pounded in his chest as he thought about everything they had uncovered so far. Project Phoenix, the treasure, the operation. It was all connected, and they were right in the middle of it. We can't just sit here and wait for them to come after us, Frank said, his voice tight with urgency. We need a plan. Mark nodded, rubbing his jaw. We've got to expose this. But we can't do it alone. We need allies, people who can help us get the truth out. Frank agreed. They had already been cut off from the outside world by the man with the electronic jammer. Their phones were useless, and they couldn't trust anyone they had previously known. They needed to find new allies, people who could help them fight back. But who could they trust? Frank's mind raced as he thought about the few people he knew who might still be on their side. And then, an idea hit him. He remembered a journalist he had met years ago, someone who had always been interested in government corruption and covert operations. Her name was Sarah, and Frank had a feeling that she could be the key to getting this information out into the open. I know someone, Frank said, his voice firm. I know someone who can help us. Mark looked up, his eyes sharp with interest. Who? Her name's Sarah? She's a journalist, and she's been investigating government cover-ups for years. If anyone can help us expose this, it's her. Mark nodded. Let's go. We don't have time to waste. Without another word, the two of them gathered their things and headed out, determined to find Sarah before it was too late. They drove through the night, staying off the main roads to avoid detection. Frank's nerves were on edge the entire time. They couldn't afford to be followed, and they had no idea how far the people behind Project Phoenix were willing to go to silence them. By dawn, they arrived in a small town on the outskirts of the city, a place where Sarah had once worked. They parked the truck in an alley and waited, scanning the area for any sign of trouble. Frank's mind raced as he thought about the files they had found, the treasure, and the dangerous network they had uncovered. He had to trust that Sarah would help them. They couldn't do this alone. After a few tense minutes, Sarah appeared, walking briskly down the street. She was exactly how Frank remembered her, sharp, focused, and always on the lookout for a story. When she saw Frank and Mark, she didn't hesitate. She approached them quickly, her expression serious. I knew you'd come, she said, her voice low. I've been watching the news. There's been talk about what you two have uncovered. People are starting to take notice. Frank felt a sense of relief wash over him. Sarah was on their side. We need your help, Frank said, his voice urgent. We've uncovered something huge, and we can't do it without you. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What have you found? Frank hesitated for a moment, then pulled out the files. He handed them to Sarah, who immediately began flipping through the documents. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the pages, and Frank could see her mind working. This is bigger than I thought, Sarah said after a long pause. I knew there were whispers about something like this, but I didn't think it was real. You're right. This goes much deeper than anyone realizes. Frank leaned forward, his voice tense. We need to expose this. The people behind Project Phoenix are powerful, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep it quiet. But we can't let them get away with it. Sarah nodded, her expression serious. I agree, but we need to be careful. If we expose this too soon, it'll be too easy for them to cover it up. We need a plan. Frank and Mark exchanged a look. They had come to Sarah for her expertise, and now it was up to her to help them figure out how to take down the operation. Sarah thought for a moment, then spoke. We need to go public, but we need to do it strategically. I can get this information to the right people, but I need to make sure we have enough evidence to back it up. We'll need to dig deeper, find more proof, and make sure we have everything we need before we make our move. Frank nodded. It was a plan, and it was the only one they had. We'll do whatever it takes, he said. Just tell us what to do. Sarah looked at them both, her eyes hard with determination. We start by gathering more evidence. We need to find out who's really behind this and who's pulling the strings. And once we've got the full picture, we take it straight to the public. Frank felt a sense of resolve settle over him. This was their chance to stop Project Phoenix, to expose the truth and bring down the people behind it. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. The operation had been hidden for decades, and the people involved would stop at nothing to protect it. They were up against powerful forces, and Frank had no illusions about how dangerous this fight was going to be. But with Sarah's help, they finally had a chance to win. The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. Frank, Mark, and Sarah worked together to dig deeper into the operation, uncovering more files, talking to informants, and piecing together the truth. They knew they had to be careful, but time was running out. The final phase of Project Phoenix was already in motion, and they couldn't let it succeed. The clock was ticking, and Frank knew that their next move would determine everything. The days that followed were a blur of action, but Frank knew time was running out. Every minute that passed was another minute that Project Phoenix could move forward. Sarah had made it clear, there were people out there who would do anything to stop them, and the more evidence they gathered, the more dangerous things became. Frank, Mark, and Sarah spent their days in the shadows, digging through old files, talking to informants, and tracing connections. They had uncovered more details about the operation's depth, but there was still so much they didn't know. They were working against the clock, and the pressure was mounting. But Frank was determined. He couldn't stop now, not after everything they had found. One night, as they sat huddled in Sarah's apartment, going over the latest batch of information, Frank's phone rang. The number was unknown. His gut tightened as he answered. Frank, you need to listen carefully. A voice on the other end said, low and urgent. They know you're getting close. You're being watched. Frank's heart raced. Who is this? He demanded. The voice didn't answer, but instead continued. They're coming for you. It's not just about you anymore. You're involved in something far bigger. They'll stop at nothing to make sure it stays hidden. The line went dead before Frank could respond. He stared at the phone in disbelief. What was that about? Mark asked, his tone sharp with concern. Frank shook his head. I don't know, but I think we've crossed a line. Whoever is behind this knows we're getting too close to the truth. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her face tense as she processed the information. We have to be careful now. If they know we're investigating, they'll come after us. But we can't stop now. We have to finish this. Frank nodded, his resolve hardening. I agree. We have to go public. We can't let them get away with this. But Mark wasn't so sure. Are you sure we're ready? If we expose this now, they could shut us down before we even get started. Frank knew Mark had a point. The operation was vast, and they were outnumbered and outgunned. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The final phase was already set in motion. If they didn't act soon, it would be too late. They needed to go public, but Frank knew they couldn't do it alone. They needed the right people, the ones who could amplify their findings, bring the truth to light. They needed media, someone who could reach the masses. After hours of debate, they made a decision. They reached out to a trusted contact Sarah knew from her investigative journalism days, a powerful news anchor with access to the right channels. The meeting was set for the following morning. Frank, Mark, and Sarah arrived early, their nerves tight. The contact was a woman named Claire, known for her fearlessness when it came to exposing corruption. She had built a reputation for taking on powerful enemies and winning. If anyone could help them take down the operation, it was her. They met at a small cafe on the edge of town, away from prying eyes. Claire was already waiting for them when they arrived. She was in her late 40s, with short black hair and sharp, focused eyes. She looked them over briefly before speaking. So, you've got something that could take down a network this big, she said, her tone even, but Frank could sense the skepticism in her voice. What exactly are we talking about? Frank laid the documents out in front of her, his hands steady despite the growing tension in the air. "We've uncovered a covert operation that's been running for decades. It involves powerful political and military figures, people with the means to cover their tracks. But we have the proof." Claire studied the papers for a long moment, her eyes scanning the text, then the maps, and finally the photos. When she looked up, her expression was serious. "This is huge," she said quietly. "You realize if we expose this, it's going to shake the very foundation of everything. These people will not go down quietly." "We know," Frank replied. "But we can't let them keep getting away with it. People need to know the truth." Claire nodded slowly. "All right, I'll take it to the network, but it's going to be risky. They'll try to stop us. You need to be ready for anything." Frank felt a sense of relief, but the unease in his gut didn't go away. They were finally going to go public, but he knew this was just the beginning. They would be targets now. "We're ready," Mark said, his voice firm. "We've come this far. We can't back down." Claire stood up and glanced around. "I'll get started on this. But you should lay low for a while. Make sure no one follows you." They left the cafe in separate directions, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what was coming. Frank didn't know how long it would take for the story to hit the news, but he could feel the weight of the truth bearing down on him. It was only a matter of time before the people behind Project Phoenix would realize that their secrets were no longer safe. And when they did, they would stop at nothing to silence those who dared to expose them. The calm before the storm felt almost unbearable, but Frank knew that they had made the right decision. The truth had to be revealed, no matter the cost. The day the story went public was the day everything changed. Frank and Mark had prepared themselves for what was to come, but nothing could have fully prepared them for the tidal wave of consequences that followed. It was all over the news. The secret operation, the treasure, the conspiracy. Every channel was broadcasting it, but with the truth came danger. As Frank watched the news in a small, dimly lit motel room, the reality of what they had done began to settle in. He had been right all along. Project Phoenix wasn't just about money, it was about control. And now that the world knew about it, there was no turning back. The people behind the operation would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, and Frank, Mark, and Sarah were now targets. The phone rang, pulling Frank from his thoughts. It was Sarah. "Frank, we've got a problem," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "They know. They're already trying to cover their tracks. The government is distancing itself from the whole thing, but I've got sources saying they're planning to take action, fast." Frank's heart sank. "What kind of action?" "They'll come after you. They'll make sure you're silenced before this spreads any further. You're not safe." Frank's grip tightened on the phone. "We can't stop now," he said firmly. "We've exposed them. We've got the evidence. We just need to make sure it sticks." Sarah was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "I'll keep pushing, Frank. But you need to stay hidden. They'll come for you, and they'll do whatever it takes to make sure the truth stays buried." Frank felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had no illusions about the danger they were in, but they had done what needed to be done. The truth was out there now. The story was too big to ignore. The question was, could they survive the fallout? As the days passed, the pressure continued to build. Reports of government officials and powerful figures scrambling to cover their tracks flooded the news. But Frank and Mark couldn't rest. They couldn't hide forever. They had to keep pushing, keep digging, and make sure the truth was heard. Frank spent sleepless nights researching, following up on every lead. He couldn't afford to stop now. He had come too far. But despite his best efforts, the sense of danger never left. They were always watching. One evening, as Frank sat in a quiet corner of a cafe, looking over more documents, he felt a sudden chill. The door opened, and a man stepped inside, someone Frank recognized from the brief encounter they had had at the cabin. The man's eyes scanned the room, but he didn't immediately see Frank. Frank's heart pounded. He had to leave. Now. Frank stood quickly, slipping the documents into his bag and heading for the door. But as he reached for the handle, the man turned, his cold eyes locking onto Frank's. "You thought you could expose us?" the man said, his voice low and dangerous. Frank's blood ran cold. "You'll never get away with it," the man continued, stepping closer. "You've crossed a line. There's no going back now." Frank's mind raced. He couldn't let them get to him. He had to escape. Without another word, Frank pushed through the door and ran into the night. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. Mark was waiting for him at their next safe house. but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they were closing in. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finishing what they had started. As he arrived at the safe house, Mark was already inside, pacing. "We need to move again," Frank said, his voice tight. "They know. They're coming for us." Mark didn't hesitate. He was already gathering their things, ready to leave. "We'll keep running if we have to," he said, his voice steady. "But we're not stopping until this is over." Frank nodded, a surge of determination rising within him. They had come this far. They weren't going to back down now. As they left the safe house, Frank felt the weight of everything on his shoulders, the truth, the danger, the people they had exposed. But he knew one thing for sure. They had made a difference. The truth had come to light, and it couldn't be silenced. The final phase of Project Phoenix might have been set in motion, but Frank and Mark had one last card to play. They would fight, not just for themselves, but for everyone who deserved to know the truth. It wasn't just about stopping an operation. It was about holding the powerful accountable and ensuring that the secrets of the past would never be buried again. As they disappeared into the night, Frank's resolve hardened. The battle wasn't over, but they would keep fighting, no matter the cost. This thrilling adventure follows a retired veteran as he uncovers dark secrets hidden beneath an old, abandoned gas station. As the story unfolds, Frank, the veteran, and his trusted ally Mark discover more than they could ever imagine. Treasures, covert operations, and powerful figures determined to keep the truth buried. With each twist and turn, they uncover more of a mysterious past that has the power to change everything. This is not just another one of those veteran stories about war and loss. It's a tale of survival, discovery, and an unrelenting fight for justice. From hidden treasures to dangerous enemies, Frank's journey forces him to navigate a web of corruption that could cost him everything. But this story is more than just about treasure. It's about the sacrifices of veterans and the untold stories that are often buried under the weight of history. As Frank battles forces that are beyond his control, he discovers that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with the will to uncover the truth. In these veteran stories, you'll see the strength, resilience, and courage that define those who have served, and the profound impact their experiences have long after they leave the battlefield. If you're a fan of veteran stories filled with suspense, danger, and redemption, this is one journey you won't want to miss.